Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Caitlin, and on this channel I upload all sorts of content relating to true crime, education and psychology related topics. So if that sounds like something you'd enjoy and you haven't already, then please do hit that subscribe button and don't forget to turn on your little notification bell so you know whenever I upload a new video. Now for today's case we're discussing the kidnapping and murder of a young girl named Maria Radolf. Now I just feel the need to put in a little disclaimer here whenever I cover cases involving children, so if any of you don't like hearing about cases involving young children, then this definitely isn't the video for you. It's not very graphic, it doesn't go into a lot of extreme detail, but I just feel the need to warn any of you if any of you don't like hearing about cases such as these. And aside from this, before we get started, I'm just going to zoom through my usual disclaimer that I like to include at the start of all my videos, just letting you guys know that I'm not claiming to be an expert in this case or any of the other cases that I cover over on my channel. I'm simply relaying the information I'm able to find myself through research of certain sources on the internet, and because only certain sources are accessible to me, it means I may get things wrong, leave things out or mispronounce things. I apologise if I do any of those things. I'm not trying to cause anyone any harm or an injustice, I'm simply working with the information I have available to me. So with all that being said, let's just get started discussing the case of Maria Radolf. Maria Elizabeth Radolf was born on March the 12th in the year of 1950 in a place called Sycamore in Illinois. She was the youngest of 4 children born to Michael and Frances Rudolph, with Maria having 1 brother and 2 sisters. At the time, Michael Rudolph worked in a local factory in Sycamore, while Frances primarily stayed at home and looked after their 4 children. And at the time of Maria disappearing in the year of 1957, she was just 7 years old. Maria had brown hair and brown eyes, and she had been a particularly good student even at such a young age. Her mother had described her as being rather high-strung, and if she were to find herself in any sort of trouble or being disciplined in some way, she would become inconsolable. She also stated in an interview that she was the only person who would be able to stop Maria from crying and screaming if she became hysterical, had one of these episodes, and she shared her opinion that if someone had intended on abducting her daughter, they would struggle to keep her quiet. On the evening of December the 3rd, 1957, the first snow of the year had begun to fall, and Maria had begged her parents to let her go out and play in it. Maria's best friend, a young girl named Kathy Sigmund, had lived on the same street as the Rudolph family. Both Maria and Kathy's parents had told the girls that they were both allowed to go out and play in the snow together once they'd finished their dinner. By the time the girls had left their homes after dinner, the sun had set, but the pair hadn't really strayed very far from where they lived. At first, while the girls were playing together out on the street, they were playing a game called Duck the Cars, where they would jump from either side of the street to avoid the car headlights. Kathy later told her parents that a man had approached the 2 girls while they were playing, and he'd asked them both if they liked dolls before offering them both piggyback rides. She hadn't recognised the man, and it appeared that neither of the girls had met him before. This man had given Maria a piggyback ride, and once he'd returned with Maria back to Kathy, Maria had run into her home to find a doll to show the man. When she'd returned, Kathy then decided to run back into her home to grab some gloves, as it was a lot colder than she had initially imagined. But when she'd walked back out onto the street, expecting to see Maria and this man, she found no sign of either of them. Kathy had headed straight to the Radolf family home and told them that she couldn't find Maria, and at first they simply thought Maria was playing with Kathy and that she would just be hiding behind a car somewhere. And because of this, the Rudolph parents had told Maria's brother, Charles, to go back out with Kathy and help her look for his sister. When an hour had passed and the 2 children had still been unable to find Maria, her parents started to realise there was something wrong. The police were called, and this had prompted an immediate search being conducted, as well as the FBI being notified because of how important those early hours in an investigation into a missing child are. Word had started to spread of the missing 7-year-old, and before long, the search for Maria Radolf was extensive, with people from all over the local area, all over Illinois, offering to help. When the authorities had tried speaking to Kathy Sigmund to see if she could remember anything about this man or anything that he had said, she'd said that he had introduced himself to the pair as Johnny. Now some sources state this, but some sources don't, but in some of the sources it stated that she recalled him telling the pair that he was 24 years old and that he wasn't married. Kathy described the man as being blonde with noticeably bad teeth and an unusually high-pitched voice, and he was wearing a a colourful sweater. With the help of the FBI behind them, the Rudolph family had proceeded to attempt to build media attention through a number of public appeals over the coming weeks. There were officers and departments across the state that were looking into known sex offenders, ex-convicts, transients, in an attempt just to narrow down anyone that may have been in the area and may have been involved in the abduction of Maria Radolf. There had been one man in particular somewhere in Illinois that had been taken in for questioning, as there had been previous reports of him offering piggyback rides to young children, but it appeared that he was deemed as not being related to Maria's disappearance specifically. Some sources I read stated that following the search for Maria beginning, Kathy Sigmund was placed into protective custody out of fear that Maria's abductor would return for Kathy in order to prevent their identity from being discovered. Police had also asked Kathy to look at a number of images of convicted criminals local to the area in the hopes that she would be able to recognise one of them as the man referred to as Johnny. There was one man in particular, a man named John Tessier, who I believe had been considered a person of interest by the authorities from early on in the investigation, but he had not been included in the lineup as he initially provided an alibi. And I will go into more detail about this suspect in particular, but just for now, I'm going to breeze through sort of the immediate details. So John Tessier had been a local resident living specifically in the same neighbourhood as the Radolf family. Now, there are some differing sources on this particular statement, but I thought I'd include it anyway, just in a full disclosure. So authorities allegedly at the time had received a tip from another local resident sharing their concern that John Tessier had been involved in the abduction of Maria, and following this he had then been put on the initial suspect list, but I'll go into a little bit more detail about that a bit later on. In December of 1957, Kathy was taken to Madison, Wisconsin in order to view a lineup of suspects in person put together by the local authorities. Following this, she had initially identified a man named Thomas Joseph Rivard as being the man that she had encountered. Rivard had been 35 years old at the time, around 5 foot 4 inches tall, with dark blonde wavy hair. Despite Kathy having identified him as the man that she believed to have seen prior to Maria's disappearance, Rivard did actually have a strong alibi. It seemed as though he had been included in the lineup as a means of filling in spaces, as his alibi could not be disputed. At the time of Maria's disappearance, he was in jail. And if you've ever studied any form of psychology or criminology, you'll know that there's often a lot of discussion regarding the accuracy of lineups and the reliability of them, especially when there are children identifying individuals from these lineups. It's entirely possible that Kathy had struggled to recall the man she'd encountered, as a lot of the time individuals experiencing a situation like this would not have intentionally focused on the details or the appearance of the unidentified individual, as they would not have necessarily been expecting anything bad to happen. Maria's case had become a widely known one, with the director of the FBI and the president of the USA taking a personal interest in the case. It seemed to shake so many people knowing that this young girl could disappear literally from the street outside of her own home, and people all across the country were fighting for this girl to be returned home. As the investigation continued, with the authorities sifting through anyone who may have been a transient in the area at the time of her disappearance, known criminals and residents matching the description of the suspect were also looked at, and there was still no solid leads to follow. The Radolf family made an appearance on TV in an appeal to gain the public's help in returning their daughter home to them, and then on the 26th of April 1958, the case changed completely when an unexpected discovery was made. 2 tourists had been out searching for mushrooms in an area of woodland near Woodbine in Illinois along the US Route 20 when they came across a set of human remains. The remains were that of a small child found only wearing a top, an undershirt and socks, and they had been hidden away slightly underneath a tree that had partially fallen down. On-scene examinations of the remains had determined that the remains had been in that location for a few months, and following the collection of DNA samples and a comparison of dental records, it was officially announced that the remains had been that of 7-year-old Maria Radolf. When Maria had disappeared, she was known to have been wearing a number of other items of clothing, including a coat, shoes, underwear, but none of these other items of clothing were ever found. In this initial investigation, it was decided that the investigators were not to take any photographs of the remains or the immediate area, out of fear that these images would eventually be leaked to newspapers and media outlets, since it had become such a high-profile case. and the autopsy that was carried out in 1958 had not been able to provide a cause of death due to the state of decomposition. Despite this, authorities had known that they needed to continue their search for the individual responsible for the kidnap and murder of Maria Rudolph, and it seemed that there remained two suspects that were returned to during the investigation. So the first of these was John Tessier, who I'd previously mentioned as someone that was initially excluded from the lineup that was shown to Kathy Sigmund as he had an alibi. So John Tessier was born on November 27th, 1939 in Belfast, Northern Ireland, under the name John Cherry. His father, British Sergeant Samuel Cherry, was killed in World War II, and then when his mother, Eileen McCulloch Cherry, met a man named Ralph Tessier while he was serving in the United States 8th Army Air Force, being stationed in RAF Bovingdon, they soon married. John had been around 7 years old at this point, and he and his mother had moved to Sycamore in Illinois with Ralph Tessier, where the couple then went on to have 6 children together. John would typically use the surname Tessier following his mother's marriage to Ralph, although he did still sometimes use the name Cherry. The home that the Tessier family lived in was less than 2 blocks away from where Maria Rudolph and her family had lived in 1957. At this point, Ralph Tessier, who was John's stepfather, had been making a living as a sign painter, and he would often be responsible for painting police cars for the local police department. And because of this, John's stepfather was known to be particularly friendly with a number of the local law enforcement members, in particular the chief of police. So John Tessier had been 18 at the time of Maria's disappearance, and he was still living in the family's home. He'd been expelled from school when he was around 16 following an incident where he was verbally and physically aggressive towards a teacher. According to his family, following this point he had been planning on joining the US Air Force as soon as he was able to. On December the 4th, 1957, following Maria's disappearance, the Tessier family home was visited by local authorities during their general search of the neighbourhood. John's half-sisters had later informed the investigators that Tessier's mother had told the authorities on that date that John had been at home with the family on the night before when Maria had disappeared. But a number of members of the Tessier family had later on testified that this wasn't true, and again I'll go into more detail about the trial later on in the video. Prior to the discovery of Maria's remains, when the FBI were initially involved in the investigation, they'd started looking into John Tessier as being potentially connected to the case. As I said previously, it's often reported that their investigation into John Tessier had started when local authorities had received a tip from a local resident, but some sources state that many people actually believed it had actually been his own parents. So these sources suggest that when his parents had realised that John had matched the description of the man known as Johnny, believed to be responsible for Maria's disappearance, they had wanted the authorities to promptly conduct a thorough search into John, as it would soon rule him out as a suspect completely. John and his parents had later told investigators that on the night of Maria's disappearance, John had been in Rockford, Illinois, as he was officially enlisting in the Air Force. This, strangely, had already been a different alibi than initially provided by his mother. According to John, the night prior to Maria's disappearance, he had been in Chicago as he was scheduled for a number of physical examinations that he was required to pass before enlisting. The following morning, he had gone to the Chicago Air Force recruiting station and then spent the day walking around Chicago seeing the sights. He then allegedly returned back in Rockford on the evening of December the 3rd, and his train had arrived there just before 7 p.m. And when he had made it to Rockford, he claimed he had called his parents, asking to be picked up and for them to drive him back to Sycamore as he had taken the train rather than driving himself. The authorities were initially able to confirm that he had been at Chicago recruiting station when he claimed through their records, as well as discovering a collect call being placed from the Rockford post office at 6:57 p.m. that evening that had been signed by John Tessier. And just for reference, as we move into breaking down theories and this potential alibi, investigators had narrowed down that they believed that Maria had been abducted around 6:20 p.m. that night. So once placing this call at around 6:57 p.m, John had met allegedly with some officers that had been stationed in the Rockford Air Force recruiting station to give them the enlisting paperwork that he had completed. And this meeting was confirmed by these officers, and they had placed it at being around 7:15 p.m. During the investigation, Tessier was taken to the local police station to carry out a polygraph test, which he did initially pass. The fact that his alibi had seemed to stand and the fact that he'd also passed the lie detector test had contributed to the decision to not include him in the lineup that was displayed to Kathy Sigmund. He was also removed from the official suspect list at this point, and the FBI had officially closed their report on Tessier around a week after Maria's disappearance. It's known that the day after being removed from the suspect list, Tessier had left to begin his training at the Lackland Air Force Base. Tessier had served for a total of 13 years and he had been promoted to captain rank in that time frame. After leaving the military, he moved to Seattle, Washington, and he soon became qualified as a police officer in a small town called Lacey. After being here for a short while, he joined the Milton, Washington Police Department, and it was known that he had faced a few troubles here. In his time working for this police department, he had managed to receive a rather extensive list of complaints about him, and as a result he seemed to have many disagreements with the chief of police. And this chief of police had allegedly even attempted to fire Tessier because of this, but it's believed that he remained employed. In 1982, Tessier was living in Tacoma in Washington, and he had encountered a 15-year-old girl named Michelle Weinman, who had been a runaway. Michelle and her friend had known Tessier as being a police officer for the Milton Police Department, and he'd offered to take in the pair and give them a place to live. Michelle Weinman had then later testified that not long into her taking up residence in Tessier's home, he had assaulted her, and as a result of this, John Tessier was charged with statutory rape. His legal team ended up pursuing plea negotiations, and as a result, Tessier pleaded guilty to communication with a minor for immoral purposes, and this charge is considered a misdemeanor as opposed to the statutory rape charge being a felony. His sentencing left him with a year of probation and formal termination from his job at the Milton Police Department. In April of 1994, John Tessier had had his name changed legally to Jack Daniel McCulloch, allegedly in a tribute to his late mother. Past this point, it's known that Tessier had worked as a security guard for quite some years before retiring. So John Tessier, or now Jack McCulloch, remained a suspect in many people's eyes prior to the reopening of the investigation in 2008. But before discussing the more recent reopening of the investigation, I'm just going to briefly mention the other suspect that remained named throughout the investigation initially. In 1997, Maria's case was officially closed, and the Sycamore police lieutenant at the time had named William Henry Redmond as the man who he believed had been the most likely responsible for her abduction and death. Redmond had previously worked as a truck driver and a carnival worker prior to his death in 1992. He remained a person of interest in this case because of the fact that in 1988 he was charged with the murder of an 8-year-old girl in 1951, despite the case then being dismissed. He had also been considered a person of interest in the Beverly Potts case in 1951, and I'll leave my coverage of this case linked down below. The Sycamore police lieutenant at the time had also shared his opinions that Redmond matched the physical appearance of Johnny, and had also claimed that he had told an inmate in prison that he had committed a crime that seemed to match the nature of Maria's case. But these claims were never supported by any form of evidence, and people's opinions appeared to be divided as to whether or not the lieutenant was operating under some other form of motive. As I said, Maria's case was officially reopened in 2008 when the half-sister of John Tessier, who was now named Jack McCulloch, her name was Janet, and she had provided the authorities with a new piece of information. Janet claimed that their mother had said something on her deathbed in 1994 that had concerned her more and more over the years. According to Janet, her mother had said to her, "Those 2 little girls, the one that disappeared, John did it. John did it, you have to tell someone." When Janet had later attempted to testify using this fact, one of her other sisters who had been present at the time had actually only heard her mother say, "He did it," so there was a lot of sort of confusion and not a lot to support her belief that this was said. However, 2 of their sisters had also testified with the fact that their mother had lied to the authorities on the first day of the investigation regarding John's whereabouts on the evening of Maria's disappearance. There were, however, arguments made that it was entirely possible for the mother to have misspoken, considering the fact that she was a cancer patient receiving morphine as a painkiller. Janet Tessier claimed that following this being shared by her mother on her deathbed, she had made numerous attempts to contact both the Sycamore Police Department and the FBI directly to report this information. But she claimed that the FBI would simply refer her straight back to the Sycamore Police Department, who in turn didn't appear interested in taking her statement. And her claims were only then taken seriously when she had emailed an Illinois State Police tip line. An extensive investigation was then launched into John Tessier, now Jack McCulloch, and the alibi that he had provided during the initial investigation all those years before. Tessier's half-sisters had informed the authorities of incidents in their childhood where John had molested them and other young girls, as well as there being another local woman who had claimed that John had offered her a piggyback ride as a child, but he had then refused to put her down, so much so that her father then ended up having to intervene. And a new theory was offered that suggested it was entirely possible for Tessier to have kidnapped Maria and then driven back to Rockford, where he then placed a phone call and met with the recruitment officers. The authorities had decided that despite the significant amount of time passing, they would still piece together a photographic lineup to show Kathy Sigmund all those years later, as she would be the only person who would have seen the suspect prior to Maria's disappearance. They had initially struggled to find an image that would accurately depict how he would have looked at the time of the case, especially since he was expelled from school at such a young age, and so he didn't have a photograph in the yearbook. But authorities had managed to track down an old girlfriend of his who had provided them with a photograph of him. And the photograph of Tessier did not match the style of the formal yearbook photographs that had also been included in the lineup, as the image of Tessier was a lot more informal, and because of this some people had stated that this may have had an impact on Kathy's response, but again that links back to the discussion of the reliability of lineups. Nonetheless, Kathy Sigmund had selected the picture of Tessier in the lineup as the one she recognised from that night. Interestingly, the same former girlfriend of Tessier's had also provided the authorities with a military-issued train ticket from December of 1957. This ticket was unused and it was for a journey from Rockford to Chicago. And because of this new knowledge, the investigators had chosen to revisit the details of Tessier's alibi, and this ticket would suggest that he did not in fact take the train to Chicago on December the 2nd as he claimed he did, as he was supposed to, but rather he had driven himself there. And this would have meant that he would have been able to drive himself back to Sycamore before abducting Maria and then driving back to Rockford in time to place the phone call to his parents and meet the recruitment officers. I do just want to reiterate that this is entirely a theory that has been offered by investigators as one plausible scenario, and it has not been proven in any sense. It's just worth including here as a form of discussion. There had also allegedly been someone who had attended school with Tessier prior to his expulsion that had remembered seeing specifically his car driving in Sycamore on the afternoon of December the 3rd, and it was known that his car had a distinctive painting on the side, I believe, and that he did not allow anyone else to drive his own car. In 2011, Tessier, now McCulloch, was taken in for questioning by the Seattle and Illinois police departments. In the report, it was initially stated that he had cooperated with the questioning and he had appeared rather calm throughout, but he allegedly became more and more agitated when he was asked questions about Maria's case and his alibi, and before long he refused completely to answer any more questions. After he had refused to cooperate any further, he was arrested with the kidnapping and murder of Maria Rudolph. And not long after this, the remains of Maria Rudolph were exhumed and re-examined, but no new DNA samples could be collected. However, one thing that did come about from this re-examination of the remains was some information relating to the cause of death. As I said previously, the coroner who carried out the initial autopsy could not list a definitive cause of death due to the rate of decomposition. But this re-examination of the remains had led to the discovery of there being at least 3 stab marks in her throat that had been inflicted by a long, sharp blade, suggesting that someone had slashed her throat. As a result of this discovery, it was decided that stabbing was a likely cause of death, although other similar causes of death could not be entirely ruled out, such as ligature strangulation. And nothing further could really be determined for certain because of the state of decomposition. The arrest and trial of Jack McCulloch gained huge amounts of public attention, and there was initially some apprehension regarding the evidence or lack thereof that conclusively linked him to Maria's abduction and murder. The trial began in September of 2012, and the prosecution had proposed the scenario that McCulloch had found himself being attracted to Maria and kidnapped her without the initial intent of murdering her, and this is where they then presented the details of the possible cause of death collected upon the recent re-examination of the remains. Kathy Sigmund had testified in the trial, stating that the man referred to as Johnny, she could identify him as being McCulloch. There had also seemingly been another friend of Maria's that testified, stating that they had witnessed another incident in which Johnny had offered Maria a piggyback ride while she was in her presence, and they had also identified this individual as being McCulloch. There were also 3 inmates who had been in jail in the presence of McCulloch, who all testified that they had heard McCulloch talking about the murder of Maria on numerous occasions. These testimonies, however, appeared to be proven inaccurate simply because there were a number of inconsistencies. So one of these inmates had testified, stating that he had heard McCulloch saying that he had killed Maria by strangling her with a wire, and another had said that he had smothered her accidentally while trying to keep her quiet, and none of these seemed to be consistent with the evidence found during the re-examination of the remains. The main argument that was offered in response by McCulloch's defence team had been that the police department and the prosecutors were pressured to implicate McCulloch as a means of solving the case quicker because of the increasing public awareness of the investigation. They claimed that there was little to no physical evidence that could tie him to the case, nor did they have any confirmation that McCulloch was even in Sycamore at the time of Maria's abduction. And then on September the 14th, 2012, 73-year-old Jack McCulloch was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Radolf. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after serving 20 years. In February of 2015, Jack McCulloch had launched an appeal in response to his convictions. The court responded by maintaining his murder conviction, but they removed his convictions of kidnapping and abducting an infant due to the fact that it was outside of the statute of limitations at the time. But this change didn't alter anything about McCulloch's sentencing, as he would still be required to serve a life sentence. It was also concluded, though, that the statement provided allegedly by his mother on her deathbed, implicating him in the kidnapping and murder that had been submitted as evidence during the trial, should not have been done so. However, this too didn't change the murder conviction, as the judge claimed that this statement or this piece of evidence provided was not particularly relied upon as a main piece of evidence during the conviction. This same year, McCulloch filed for post-conviction relief, requesting to have his murder conviction set aside. It was initially dismissed, but he had remained in contact with the public defender that he had been assigned to during his trial, and this defender had pleaded with the court, asking them to reconsider. As a result of his legal advice, McCulloch had filed a successive motion which couldn't be dismissed or denied until a formal hearing was conducted by the state attorney's office. A state attorney who had received these motions had conducted his own review of all of the evidence, and he had decided that McCulloch was innocent based on this evidence. He claimed that he believed there was evidence that was purposefully left out of the trial that would prove McCulloch's location at the time of Maria's disappearance that would have proven that he couldn't have been involved. In April of 2016, following a hearing, McCulloch's original murder conviction was dismissed and a new trial was ordered. While this was occurring, McCulloch did remain charged with the crime, but he was released on bail while awaiting new trial. And in the following week, the judge dismissed the charges without prejudice, which meant that he could still be taken to trial for the murder of Maria Rudolph if there was a prosecutor that wished to do so. And on April the 12th, 2017, Jack McCulloch was declared as innocent of the kidnapping and murder of Maria Rudolph. Maria's case and the subsequent legal battle involving Jack McCulloch had gained so much attention over the years that there appears to be so many opposing opinions. It seems that while some people are adamant that McCulloch was guilty and he had managed to escape the conviction, there are others out there that believe that the authorities had just been under so much pressure to solve the case that they jumped the gun. So please do let me know your guys' thoughts down below. But that is where I'm going to end today's video, and as always, my heart goes out to Maria and her family, and I do hope, as I say in all my videos, that one day answers can be found. So thank you guys so much for watching. Like I said, don't forget to leave your thoughts on the case down below, and if you have any other case requests, then please feel free to leave them as well. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this interesting, and I'll see you guys very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.